G'day folks, ZiggyD here. This video is my reply guy response to Ben's recent PoE 2 critique, the ups and downs of PoE 2, or is PoE 2 good, released several days ago. For those who don't know Ben, they are one of the top Path of Exile players, having won countless events and world firsts. It's not necessarily that being the best player at something makes your opinion more relevant to the average player. It can kind of actually do the opposite, as Ben plays a different game to you or I. But their insights into the game are extremely specific and nuanced, and that could be a real interesting angle to discuss things from. And for those who don't know ZiggyD, that's me, possibly one of the more relatable Path of Exile content creators, because even after playing for more than a decade, I'm not very good at the game. But maybe that gives me a perspective more common to the average PoE 2 player as far as things like gameplay and difficulty are concerned. Other than that, I've been in the ZiggyD offices many times now, I've seen behind the scenes of their development, and I often help them announce new content as well as host things like the live community Q&As. So maybe that gives me some interesting perspective on the development and marketing of the game. Anyway, I thought Ben's video was interesting, it sounded frustrated, and worth a deep dive. So let's get into it.
I don't feel like I have the energy right now, but whenever I do want to actually give a proper PoE 2 talk, I can give you a preview of what the first 5 words are going to be. I don't understand why PoE 2 exists.
I'll just add a note here that a big goal for Path of Exile 2 that Ben missed was to create a new character rigging and animation system. And that was a huge deal that opens up a lot of follow-on improvements to the game. Better controls like WASD movement, skills that incorporate dynamic character movement, better scaling for attack speed with varied animations and things like that. A lot of stuff that they just couldn't really do with Path of Exile 1. It's the single biggest upgrade to the game because it has so much effect on not only the visuals of the game, but also the physical gameplay itself, as well as the design space they can take advantage of with things like skills. It's probably something that's actually going to take a bit of time for them to really realize the full potential of. It's pretty easy to overlook, but I totally think that this is the biggest aspect of what Path of Exile 2 is doing. Now, could they have done this animation system and this rigging update in Path of Exile 1? I imagine that they probably couldn't have done it without breaking everything that exists in that game already and having to redo everything. And that'd effectively mean that Path of Exile 1 would have become Path of Exile 2. So PoE 1 would have been deleted, and that's obviously something you wanted to avoid. Part of why they had to separate the games ultimately.
The one single thing that PoE 2 actually does better than the first game is the new player experience in the campaign. It is so much better. This game's campaign experience is dog shit if you don't know what's happening. Vendors use 9 different currencies to buy things, gems, or 9 different currencies. It sucks. It's really bad. Whereas in PoE 2, the uncut skill gems and the vendors all being gold, it's so much easier to follow and understand what's happening. The hand holding of the gem system for recommended stuff, even though often it's not the best, is way better than here's a window with 95 gems in it, good luck. The way the game kind of pushes you into these archetypes of lightning versus whatever else, it all kind of it's just way easier. The game is way easier to play if you don't know what's happening. And that's really good.
Path of Exile 2 does the new player experience and campaign significantly better than PoE 1 for sure. It's less overloaded, more well thought out, better looking, better feeling, more engaging, and more fun. I will note that I think that the campaign suffers from serious pacing issues that they do need to address. There's too many zones that are just way too large, but I expect that's something that they'll be fixing before or maybe when they add more acts especially. It's what they've done in the past with Path of Exile 1. They trimmed a lot of the fat from a lot of the zones when they added new acts to the game. So I anticipate we'll see the same thing here, and it really does need to happen. That pacing is a bit off.
And the moment you leave Act 3, or really Act 6 maybe, and start mapping, it just is bad. If I think about every single change from the first game to the second game, I almost can't think of a single positive change when it comes to actual endgame content.
It was inevitable that Path of Exile 2's endgame would be substantially worse than Path of Exile 1's. ZiggyD decided only a few months before release to pivot to actually even having an endgame for the beta release instead of just a campaign. I don't know what they had before, some basic mapping system or randomly generated zones, I don't know. This is, though, their version 0.1 of the endgame. The campaign's first acts, Act 1 especially, are at version 0.9 at this point, I feel. Those campaign early acts have gone through years of revisions, new ideas that have been tested and dismissed and then done in a better way, and then countless playtests at this point. But the endgame is this like raw first draft, and it's quite likely the first idea for a novel take on Path of Exile endgame that they've had. It's got some pretty interesting and experimental ideas that could end up leading to some new refinements down the line. The same way that Path of Exile 1's early and admittedly pretty rough endgame ideas that have since been scrapped eventually led to where it is now, which is incredible if you haven't played it, by the way. Unparalleled, industry-leading customization, options for playstyles, and satisfying progression. PoE 1's endgame is in a really good state right now, I feel. I think it's well worth discussing and critiquing the current Path of Exile 2 endgame in specific detail, but endgame is where I do give ZiggyD a ton of leeway at this point to cook, because I have very low expectations for this current first iteration. It's pretty wild the amount of stuff that they tried to launch early access with in terms of the endgame. Like, there's quite a bit of content there, I feel, for this initial launch. And the quantity combined with how recently it was even conceptualized means most of it feels very alpha right now compared to the rest of the game especially. So that makes it even more stark, that comparison. And then the bar for my expectations for it with those things in mind is just very low. So to be honest, I expect that for 1.0's launch, endgame will be almost unrecognizable from what we have now. There's probably a pretty good chance that even when Acts 4, 5, and 6 are added to the game, that changes the entire kind of like core endgame story thing that's going on. Like, this one feels like a placeholder based on the end of Act 3. They did say they were doing something special with the story as like a temporary situation, so there's going to be some big changes, I expect. But I reckon we will probably be able to trace back a couple innovations that we end up with that are pretty new and interesting to here, to what we have now, this early, pretty dodgy system.
Like, the change from killing a map boss to killing all rares, who wants that? Like, every time I hit tab and scroll through a map trying to find the rare that's hiding in the corner to kill to get progress, like, it's just bad. The map bosses aren't in every map. Why? Map bosses are cool. They're fun. Why can I go an hour without fighting one sometimes? It just makes no sense.
So I hard agree with Ben on this one. I was intrigued by their idea of not having map bosses in every map because in theory, it allows a greater variety of builds to focus on what they enjoy, right? One of your builds is great at speed mapping, so you focus on bossless maps, and the other build is great at bossing, so it can focus on that. In general, that's a good thing for the endgame to have that variety, different things that you can specialize in. Path of Exile 1 has started doing that well of late. But in practice, there doesn't really seem to be much of an upside to the current design of many maps just not having a boss. I haven't felt anyone being super glad of that fact. I certainly haven't felt glad of that fact. The bosses are great fun and rewarding, and the difficulty on them actually feels pretty good from someone who's playing like a B tier build. B for balanced. But the bossless maps, at best, feel anticlimactic. That's at best. I often don't even remember if I completed one of the bossless maps if I leave to stash my loot. Did I actually finish that map? I don't remember. I have to go in and check. And at worst, like Ben describes, the bossless maps are filled with lots of backtracking and are super boring where you have to track down a rare that's like the start of the map. The checkpoint system is a nice little band-aid solution for now, but there's going to have to be further refinements there for sure.
Towers, Jesus Christ. Sections got depreciated because they were tedious, and sections are like 1,000 times better than towers. Map layouts, like the worst PoE 1 map layout is S+ in PoE 2. I didn't even think it was possible to design map layouts that are so unfun. And checkpoints got added, Jesus man. The moment people started asking for checkpoints in maps, that should have been infinite red flags exploding out of every single corner. If layouts are so dog that players want checkpoints, that needs to be like a complete redesign of how layouts work. It's like, how are 80% of layouts like unrunnable? Like augury, like
Towers and map layouts need a lot more discussion. It's all part of an issue of what I'll call endgame pacing. The new tower layouts are great. That was a big improvement for sure, but they are still just anticlimactic, small, and less interesting maps. I really think that each tower should have some chunky big thing that is guarding it, right? Like bosses for sure, but also like an Uber breach or some rapid waves of assaulting enemies that you have to defend against. They can do some tower defense thing there. Or maybe even like a tower that's been overtaken by a delirium boss who's taken up residence, and that's like their kingdom that you have to invade and conquer, and there's some, you know, creepy delirium mechanics going on in there. There's a lot more that they can do with this concept. Right now, they feel very, very empty. The idea of putting waystones into towers right now just doesn't work because they're small maps devoid of extra mechanics, so why would you do anything but toss a shitty waystone in there? And then the second topic is more what Ben is kind of referring to here, sextants, towers being like sextants. So basically a circle of effects buffing maps around it in some way. They both do the same thing if you're unfamiliar. I'll say this, I am in favor of spending less time in our hideouts rolling maps and more time in the actual combat gameplay of Path of Exile. I kind of loathe spam clicking sextants and things like that, and would much rather be doing combat. Towers in theory can help us achieve that goal by turning a hideout chore into a piece of actual gameplay, so I'm on board with that concept. But there is another issue. The way it is right now, you spend a lot of time setting up in less interesting gameplay. Making the towers themselves much more interesting does and has helped, but a lot of that time is just spent in travel maps with not much going on. They're not buffed by towers, they don't have any bosses in them, you're just going through big wide open kind of general layout maps hunting down rare monsters, right? Something needs to be done here if towers are to really work as a system, such as things like smaller maps in general, less maps between the towers. It feels like there's a lot of maps there, especially given how big they are. And then more stuff happening in those like fewer smaller maps. So I actually had a random idea a bit back, if you'll allow me to do some like armchair development here. So bear with me for a second. Maps are called waystones, right? Based on this idea that they allow you to travel between areas. So what if waystones were the traveling ones? And then there was another type of item called maps. I don't know, just for example. So waystones could be these like very, very short zones where you run down a road or go up a path or you cross a bridge, and then they have some interesting encounter in them. So they're just a short travel-based map, right, of you progressing through to a more interesting location, but something cool happens along the way. They're a random encounter, effectively, in item form. You could have things like league mechanics, an ambush of some description. Maybe there's like a general leading a patrol there that you can hunt down, and that can help point you towards some of the bigger quest stuff. You could use these fun little like waystones to travel to the next cluster of towers and zip around the atlas to find more cool stuff to do. And then the actual maps would be what we have currently, like these big mega zones that we can juice up with lots of mechanics in them. They can have 3 breaches and an expedition and all this other stuff inside of them. And those are the things that we juice up with the towers. Like when we get to that tower cluster, we chuck all of those in there, and that's where we do some real farming. So the net results would hopefully be something like fun, fast traveling with the waystones while you move around and set up, and then you get that big session of farming with the actual maps. Much better pacing overall, I think. And it still keeps that variety that they're going for with this current system, but hopefully in a way that would work a lot better. Anyway, that's just some armchair dev daydreaming. Obviously, I have no idea the practicalities of making a video game. It's probably many solutions, but obviously the current loop is a bit slow and unsatisfying.
The way loot works in the endgame, 95% of all items drop from rare monsters. Every single trash monster, there's no reason to kill it except for experience. It won't drop loot. It will never drop an item that matters.
So I think this was a strange and maybe not fully formed thought from Ben. Naturally, most of the loot drops are going to be from rare monsters, which are like substantially more challenging and thus more rewarding than white or magic monsters. That kind of makes sense. So it'd be easy to dismiss Ben's comment here as a bit silly, but I'd like to devil's advocate and consider it as earnestly as possible. And it got me thinking of a few more points that I want to add. So rare monsters need better visual signaling. They're rewarding and can be fairly engaging from time to time, depending on how powerful your build is, but half the time I don't even know where they are or which monster in a pack is the actual rare one. You know, unless they have like one of the specific auras or some big obvious ability, a lot of the time I just miss them. I do think it'd be great to have some more reasons to be excited about magic monsters too. So to like care when they're rolled on a map, for example, or when you run into a pack of them. Keepers of the Trove in Path of Exile 1, for example, which made every magic monster in a pack drop an item of a specific type. Getting 5 to 10 amulets in Path of Exile 2 would be pretty dang fun. More things like that to make magics more interesting would be good. I don't even remember that they exist most of the time now. And then map boss loot is another thing that I just wanted to mention. I'm not sure how I feel about it at the moment. They actually do feel like they drop a pretty decent amount of loot as it stands, but I do recall that Grinding Gear Games did say that map bosses were intended to drop a very significant percentage of the map's loot when they appeared. Like, I feel like 40% or something, but I couldn't find the direct quote of that one. So take that with a grain of salt. But right now they do feel well balanced for if they were present in every map. But if they really want to stick with this like map bosses only sometimes crop up thing, then they probably want them to be a bit bigger of a fight with a lot more loot.
And like the breach problem as well, like 90% of all loot comes from breaches.
So breach definitely feels out of place, both as an initial pick for a league mechanic in PoE 2. I was very surprised when I saw that. It's very Path of Exile 1 zoom, and it has like had the density and speed of enemies that we'd expect from that game, not what they're aiming for in Path of Exile 2. Some of you may love Breach now, especially if you're playing the current set of builds that play like high-end Path of Exile 1 builds, blowing up the entire screen with Herald of Ice, because it plays pretty well like that, right? It's just like you're playing PoE 1 again. Breach's gameplay matches those builds pretty well. I'm pretty sure, though, that those builds and Breach are very far away from what Path of Exile 2 plans to play like for the most part. And so Breach is pretty out of place. Don't get me wrong, it is very fun blowing up tons of monsters, and even when I only clear half the Breach, I still kind of love it. And if I guess that was the norm and expectation, maybe it wouldn't be too bad. But I'm kind of surprised they didn't like hold Breach back until post-launch or something and launched with it. I guess people do like kill things in circles. And as for the loot, with a single Breach having as many rares as the rest of the map sometimes, it's obviously super out of whack. I don't really know what their solution will be for Breach, but if it sticks around as it is, it'll likely cause issues with balancing rewards for everything else in maps.
And like so much of this shit is like, oh, you can hand me the way with, oh, it's early access. But is it really? Like, I mean, to me, when I hear like early access / beta, what I think is this is an unfinished game that's going to be changed a lot constantly. It's been 2 months. What's changed? Like, what's changed? There's not even balance changes happening until resets come out, like with new leagues, as if it's a fully released game. I don't get it, man. I don't get it.
So this one is kind of tough. When GGG were doing back-to-back balance changes at the start there, nerfing a bunch of stuff, I was kind of happy just to see like how active they were being. It seemed like they were gearing up for a pretty constant update schedule. I was like pretty excited by that fact. But they seemingly can't really do constant updates on live for a number of reasons. So firstly, the community reaction to the nerfs to the broken and overpowered stuff was pretty negative, which is understandable, as people's fun was taken away, right? The builds they were actively playing were nerfed, and that's a surefire way to make a player lose some motivation. The fact is that even in early access, even though that should be present in people's mind and allow for a greater like freedom for them to make balance changes, they still are bound by this kind of unspoken rule that you can only really deliver buffs and quality of life fixes into a live realm. Nerfs need to be reserved for a fresh start. That's kind of the rule, as it turns out. It's far more tolerable when a build you're going to play is nerfed, rather than the build you're currently playing. And on top of that, to get good data, they really need to do these balance changes into a fresh start to evaluate things. Otherwise, you just get people respeccing with their, hundreds of divs of gear, and they can't really get a clean data set from that or any good feedback. They also have this issue of marketing that's been talked about a long time ago, back in Path of Exile 1, when they moved to like this 3-monthly cycle that they did. The press and social media and things like that light up, they explode when they do big releases, and that brings players back to the game. Constant smaller changes and additions to the game, just drip fed over time, does help to slow down player count drop off a bit, but it doesn't get the media coverage in the same way, and not like any one change by itself in isolation is large enough to get people's attention to actually return to the game. So it's not a very good strategy for the way that Path of Exile has worked for the last decade, and likely will continue to be the case even in early access here. As such, they're forced into doing a league cycle style update schedule of something every few months, because it takes them that long to make enough content that's good enough to release all at once. And of course, so that they don't nerf people actively playing. So is a 3 to 4 month release cycle fast enough for the beta though? Like, will the game be ready to launch in a year on that schedule? Well, I'd certainly love to see a lot more updates a lot faster, of course, but I think it'll come down to how big this bigger update really is. If they get like several classes along with their skills and weapon types in, plus maybe a new act and a chunky endgame overhaul into each 3-month release, then I think that'd work. It's going to be tough, that's a lot to do, but I hope they can pull it off.
If PoE 2 stayed with its original scope of new campaign, new gym system, shared endgame, God, it would have been so sick.
So as Ben described, that would have been a sick major expansion for Path of Exile 1. I don't think Path of Exile 2 would nearly have gotten the same attention or success that it's had so far if they had kept it as a Path of Exile 1 add-on update like they'd planned. The combined PoE 1 and 2 would have continued to grow as PoE 1 had been growing, like it had been growing, and it would have continued to happen. But it wouldn't have had nearly the same potential that Path of Exile 2 has now, I think. Both in terms of like player growth and attention, but also in terms of what the game can achieve and be. I guess this might be kind of like a fundamental vibe difference between me and Ben here and how we're feeling about the game. For me, for my part, despite all the issues, I'm pretty optimistic and very excited for the future of PoE 2. I've seen them go from a worse state with a game, far, far worse, into something incredible before with a less skilled, smaller team, right? And I think they're going to do it again here. I've seen the team grow and mature a lot over the years. Sure, they've lost a couple OGs from the early PoE 1 team, but this isn't like those situations where your beloved game company from your childhood is not even the same company anymore. Most of them are still there, and there's no brain drain going on here. It's quite the opposite. Look at like Mark, aka Neon's boss design improve over the years. This guy's a legend of designing this sort of thing. Look at the art and effects team grow, far more talented of late. The skill design team going from making things like Glacial Hammer to the skills that Monk has now, for example. Sure, project management on the combined Path of Exile 2 and 1 has obviously been a new challenge for them. They've never had to do kind of 2 games at once here and deal with the scope of what they're dealing with now, so that's obviously a big deal, and they have struggled with it. But I don't think there's anyone else in the industry more competitive to make an action RPG on the scope of PoE 2 right now. And I think it's the right move for them to try and do so. It'd be such a tragic waste to aim so low as the Path of Exile 1 expansion that Path of Exile 2 was originally going to be.
But like that endgame, it's not even like, oh, it's neat, just needs time to cook. It's just like every single change feels like it's just a change because it needed to be different than the first game. But I don't understand how it's better.
I kind of disagree with that. I think there's value in right now making changes just for the sake of it. People remark a lot about how ZiggyD have already learned these lessons and solved these problems in PoE 1. Why are they making the same mistakes? But I say, now's the time to re-ask those questions. Maybe specific change X or Y needed to happen for Path of Exile 1, right? Maybe doing those the same way in Path of Exile 2 will still be the right choice. But now is the time to do some science and find out for sure. Because Path of Exile 1 is a well-executed result of band-aids on top of band-aids, ultimately. A decade of band-aids stacked on top of each other in an elegant and well-balanced fashion. We don't necessarily need to jump straight to the band-aid solution here, but maybe we can, get a little bit deeper in and reset the broken bone, and as a result, end up with a better long-term outcome.
And the phrase meaningful combat, I swear to God, I've heard the phrase meaningful combat 100 times in the last 2 years. PoE 2 has the most meaningless combat of any single RPG I've ever played. It doesn't exist. There is no combat. Every single build, you use one button, you right click, the entire screen explodes. Like, what the fuck? Why? Why is that a thing? Why is that still a thing 2 months later? Like, people are gonna be so used to that when they finally take it away, there's gonna be so much complaining. And it is just so boring. Like, killing monsters in that game is so boring. Because you don't do anything. Even when I tried to not do that kind of setup, and intentionally skipped heralds on crossbows, it's the same thing. You press Galvanic Arrow, the entire screen explodes.
Firstly, the campaign's combat is obviously way more engaging than the endgames, and we've established quite well that endgame is not what's intended right now. It's hard to engage in meaningful combat when swarmed in a breach, for example. That said, this opinion from Ben I think is pretty subjective based on his skill level and the build he plays. He mentions trying to not abuse certain things, but you can't really unsee behind the veil, You can't unlearn being as good as he is. There's a good chunk of builds led by a specific handful of items, skills, and interactions that are just way outside of what PoE 2's combat is designed for. Some of these builds look crazier than high-end PoE 1 builds. It's crazy. But I don't think we can judge the design of meaningful combat in PoE 2 through the lens of the current Herald of Ice interactions or stat stacking setups with Hand of Wisdom and Action and so on. Some of these are just so downright unintended that they feel like bugs. As I mentioned at the start, I'm pretty relatable as a normie of a player, and I'm playing a build that has what I suspect is the intended level of power for Path of Exile 2's endgame. So pretty bad by comparison. If I just put my blinders on for a second and don't look at those other builds, I feel pretty strong, but still challenged and engaged in the combat. I have some very powerful crowd control, reasonably decent AoE, and good enough damage to destroy most rares and smaller bosses. The larger bosses like the Final Sanctum boss or some juiced map bosses after I got the difficulty increased passive nodes, they still offer a challenge I have to be engaging with. And the occasional rare monsters in certain maps do present a real danger. And even in easier content, I still have to consider how I move around and how I use my skills, make sure that I do things properly. If I don't like lead into a room with grenades first to make sure that I electrocute the enemies inside, I can die, right? If I don't use good dodge rolls and good perpendicular movement as I clear, I can die. It's overall really fun, and I've enjoyed the endgame quite a bit more than others, I think, as a result of it. I would probably be pretty bored going through all these hunt down the rare monster maps if I was, you know, just kind of tapping the screens. I keep coming back to playing this B tier build as well, despite multiple attempts to reroll. I kind of know what's going on there. Maybe it's just because I'm getting that meaningful combat. So I don't think this pursuit of meaningful combat is such a far off dream or as much of a joke as Ben claims it is. Not from my perspective, at least.
Have you played a bad build in PoE 2 yet? Because I have. I have. That's how I started PoE 2. Was in multiple bad melee builds. It's like Titan, if you play it properly, is really good. If you do Herald Abuse, you just one-shot the screen easily. But like playing actual bad melee builds, the pushy, no phasing system genuinely made me almost quit the game on day 3. Like it's just like the clunkiest, least fun combat I've ever experienced.
Melee Warrior's biggest issue, in my opinion, is that of pushiness. I agree, this is a huge issue that needs addressing. Warriors getting jostled around and being unable to walk through trash enemies is, I think, the biggest factor in why it's such a rough experience for so many people. Unreasonable builds, that is, because builds that blow up the screen with Herald of Ice don't really care about pushiness. But to really nail down good engaging combat on those more reasonable builds, especially melee, then pushiness is top priority. So Mace skills really need to be able to push everything out of the way, I think, except like the biggest enemies in bosses. Why does like Rolling Slam's first attack like get blocked by things? Same as that charging skill, right? Doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't fit the theme and flavor or feeling of what Warrior is supposed to be conveying, I think. You feel so pathetic. And armor slows down your movement speed, so why doesn't it also make you harder to move, right? It makes it harder for you to move, why doesn't it make it hard for enemies to move you? I feel like you should have some sort of increased mass when wearing armor gear as like a hidden benefit, just like that hidden move speed drawback. Making you less easily pushed and more easily push small enemies away. This mass system could be something they could play with in a few areas. So, for example, they could have some passives associated with stun or strength that could have increased mass as well. Beef could have increased mass. Evasive or less pushy characters, so your more agile evasion characters, could instead get things like size reductions during ability uses to make them more slippery and able to slip between monsters, so they can kind of like avoid the pushiness. Whereas your beefy warriors should have your mass, increased girth. In general, I don't really think that your character should ever really be pushed unless it's being hit by some big boss swipe or a well-signaled charging attack, or if the attack was powerful enough to actually stun you. I think this situation that we have right now where you're being pushed while you're still actually controlling your character and trying to move is super janky looking, because you get this situation where your character's walking forwards while they're being pushed backwards and they do this weird stutter thing. It looks bad and it feels bad. And I think the amount of times that we're pushed in the game should be very specific and well thought out.
The thing with Path of Exile 1, when you get to a character that's like just zoomer, cracked, completely broken, the game is still, like, the game keeps getting more and more fun. Because there's one super important thing you can do in this game, and that is scale speed. Like, when it comes to how a character functions in ARPGs, there's like 3 categories. There's defense, offense, and speed. And this game, you are constantly being just like thrown into scenarios where you're choosing one of the 3. And anytime you choose one, the other 2 suffer a little bit. In PoE 2, it took me like, by level 90, like my Titan would right click and one shot the whole screen. And from that point forward, there's nothing that I could ever do to improve the character. I could play for 1,000 hours, it would never get better. Unless I like migrated to Trade League and bought Temporalis, because there's no way to invest in speed except one dumbass unique item.
So Path of Exile 1 does a good job of having speed be the primary axis of scaling. It's fun and it works well in that game. I think there should always be some speed scaling. Should always be able to get a bit faster. But I think Ben's view here is a little narrow in that not every game and not every action RPG needs to have speed be the primary scaling method. I have some reasons for this. To be clear, I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to become more powerful and thus able to kill bosses and clear maps faster. That should always be a thing. Your clear speed should go up because you're killing things better, right? And not having to like run away to recover or play too defensively. Your speed can increase through those vectors. What I'm saying is that attack speed, cast speed, and movement speed does not have to be the most important part of scaling in every action RPG, nor does it have to be kind of like infinite. And that's because there are drawbacks to speed scaling. As speed increases, so too does the risk of things like animations becoming janky and meaningless, the game ceasing to make visual sense, starting to get things like performance issues and server issues. And then like, in order for new content added to the game to threaten the player when you've scaled speed a lot, enemies have to do things like slow down the player, be faster than the player, which is obviously going to be really fast, or kill the player with cheap tricks like on-death effects. None of those are fun, they suck, and if they sound familiar, it's because Path of Exile 1 has all of these issues. Path of Exile 1 has done a decent job of making speed be a really fun aspect of the scaling, but on-death effects, a plethora of varieties of slows that can't be countered by things that say you can't be slowed and whatnot, because they have to keep inventing new slows to slow you down. Things like non-existent visual clarity and performance issues are some of the biggest problems in Path of Exile 1, I think. Any long-term PoE 1 player can attest to that. Path of Exile 2 can be a game where speed is something that you can scale a bit, but where it's not the most important scaler, and that'll help avoid those issues and give more chance for enemies to also be slow, and for that meaningful combat to be made into a reality.
By level 90, like my Titan would right-click and one-shot the whole screen, and from that point forward, there's nothing that I could ever do to improve the character. I could play for 1,000 hours, it would never get better, unless I like migrated to Trade League and bought Temporalis, because there's no way to invest in speed except one dumbass unique item.
I think in PoE 2, being able to one-shot the entire screen or kill every boss before they can attack should be where you have won the game, right? When you're at the absolute peak, the pinnacle, it's probably fine for there to be no real scaling beyond that. Maybe not for Ben, because he's going to get there much sooner than others and still wants some more game to play. I kind of understand that perspective. But I don't know, man. I don't think that's like the goal of meaningful combat, but rather a trophy you get for having won. You know, congrats, time to think of your next build or come back next league. Items like Temporalis should be rare, valuable, and one of the like last things that you equip before you reach that win condition. It's like a trophy, right? It's fine for items like that to exist in my opinion, as long as they aren't considered a part of the normal gameplay and thus aren't balanced around. When they start affecting the normal gameplay in really large manners, that's when they need to be taken a bit more seriously. I think having a cap on scaling the speed of players that have, you know, beaten the game is important as well, because this is an economic game, and you want the people who are one-shotting everything to be very rich, right? Like they've earned that reward, but you do want to cap the amount of economic damage that they can do, somewhat at least. You want to make sure that they're just one-shotting single screens and not 4 screens, or not the whole map, to prevent their fun from getting so potent that it ruins the fun of all of the normies too much.
Oh, I didn't even talk about crafting. Holy shit. That was like a 10-minute rant. I didn't talk about crafting. My god. Gear acquisition. What the f? Long before PoE 2 came out, we had to talk about why other ARPGs suck compared to Path of Exile 1. Like, one defining factor that was super important to me. If the only way to get gear is to kill a monster and hope it drops a good item, that's really bad. That's really, really, really bad. And that was like D3's problem. That kind of became D4's problem as well. Like, that's not interesting. And PoE 1 has like 8 systems that are, you know, that all are good at their own individual crafting thing, like essences, harvest, delve, metacrafting, scouralking, all things you're accommodating right now. Like, there's so many different things, and they're all good for different items. And then also in the early game, like day 1, day 2, first 20, 30 hours, like you wear shit you ID'd off the ground. Like, that has a place too, but it just gets outscaled, which I think is good.
Path of Exile 1 has reached a pretty great place in terms of having a ton of great ways to reach your goals. Even solo self-found is really fun and viable in that game now. The last couple of years, I've just loved crafting, and I've tried as much as I can to get more people into it, making guides and talking about it ceaselessly and trying to engage in it more and more myself. But people just don't engage in crafting. That type of crafting with that much stuff going on. It's just too much. It hurts people's brains, and I get it. So few people can really engage on the level that even I do, and certainly not Ben or anyone else who really like uses all of those available crafting systems in Path of Exile 1. It's obviously just too much, and it's a massive overload for new players especially. Path of Exile 2 is unfortunately a bit of a needed reset in that regard. Even if it's not personally what I want, it's probably what's needed for the majority. And as they add more leagues and systems, each is going to come with some way of gearing or crafting that'll expand it back out. And we'll probably see Path of Exile 2 being just as bloated with this stuff in 5 years' time. Probably even faster than it was in Path of Exile 1 because they're starting, you know, a bit more further along that line. And that's probably fine. Path of Exile 3 can fix that problem then. That's PoE 3's problem. I do agree with Ben's point that action RPGs shouldn't rely on only dropped items to gear, but there's some important goals here that Path of Exile 2 is trying to aim for. There's the scaling back things to make it more easily engageable with for most players, of course, and the making items drop matter again. It's like making the things that drop actually important. It's pretty crucial for newer or even average players because they're much more likely to actually be able to progress if the better items are more strongly related to drop loots. Allow me to explain here. So, Path of Exile 1, it's quite possible for newer players to just have no idea how to go about getting anything of value. Because how are they supposed to know things like, when it comes to a rare or magic item, the only possible valuable ones are fractured items, or a specific drop from a specific chest in a specific delve node, right? In Path of Exile 1, a lot of the most valuable rare gear can only be produced by crafting. It physically cannot drop. There's no way for that to happen. And while that's like really fun for crafting, it means your average player can't really ever loot something good. They just have to farm currency and buy things. Now, as an economic game, the same will still be largely true for Path of Exile 2. You'll still mostly farm currency to buy things. That's the way an economic game works. That'll never not be true. But it's at least feasible that a top 90% item can actually drop. And it can drop for anyone. And I think that's a good thing.
Every single map that I run in PoE 2, I have to pick up every single base type of every single item that I could ever wear, put them all in a quad tab, and then eventually when I get enough, I alch them all, / like augment, transmute, regal, whatever, and then 3-to-1 them in the most like tedious clunky way ever. Like the 3-to-1 thing, instead of being a vendor, like the whole vendoring getting split up into like 6 different systems is one of those changes that's the exact same as the well. It is thematically good. It makes sense in universe, lore wise, it's good. But when I'm playing the game, I don't care about that. I care about fun. And if I want to turn 21 necrotic armors into 7 rare necrotic armors, I'd rather just vendor all of them at once. I mean, necrotic armors you can't do because, you know, they don't really fit in the window. But like with smaller things, like if I have 40 breach rings, I could just vendor 40 of them and get back like 16 rares. But instead, it's like I'm gonna spend 2 minutes doing a little 3-to-1 thing with an animation. It's like cool, it looks cool, lore, themes, cool, but like it's so tedious. Tedious is like the key word for everything regarding the endgame mapping and whatnot. Like I do a map, I leave, I scrap certain things based on if they have quality or sockets. I maybe disenchant if I need regal shards, I vendor if not, but only vendor bad bases that I picked up. Good bases have to go into a certain quad tab, and there's no affinities for any of this, and there never will be because you can't really set them up that way. And then you go back to your main quad tab to dump in all of your other shit, and it's like there's just like so much shit. Like one of the best things about this game in the end game is when you reach a point where you stop picking up 6 sockets, you've outscaled rare items off the ground, and you leave the game, or the map, you dump into your quad tab, 90% of your loot is going into affinity tabs. You put in the next map, you go. You can just grind.
So, hard agree on all of this. I actually told them before launch that the salvage bents and disenchanting vendor should not be separate things. It's unhinged and very tedious. These mechanics can and should be introduced one by one in a way that is done slowly like they are now. That's good. But then by endgame, you should have unlocked a method of doing these gear management chores in bulk. Because by that point, you're already familiar with the systems, you've learnt it, it's been tutorialized for you, you've experienced the flavor and the world building and all of that, and you're starting to do things at a larger volume as you get into endgame. The goal should be then, for the developers to ease physical discomfort, and to make things feel better to do, to make the gameplay fun and not annoying, and reduce that unpleasant friction in the UI. ZiggyD, please give us bulk 3-to-1, give us a single bench or NPC who disenchants, sells for gold, salvages or combines items as needed. I don't know, have like a toggle or something. I'm actually in support of this picking up more items and managing them aspect that Path of Exile 2 is going for. I think that's cool, but I want to be excited about a white amulet drop, not like thinking about, I gotta do all these like tedious stashing and stuff like that. You have to support this item drops matter thing, by making the experience of looting and stashing those items actually fun.
And map prepping, holy, like I'm currently at like the worst part of Path of Exile 1 map prepping, which is I'm still doing blue maps. My sustain isn't good enough to bulk roll, and it's still like way nicer because I don't have that horrendous fucking Atlas tree. I can run maps that I want to run when I want to run them. I can roll them bulk like 20 in advance and then just grab all 20, put them in the inventory, and just blast. On the Atlas passive tree, there is no Atlas passive tree. You have 30 points and they all say you drop more loot. Like they all say you drop 1% more loot. That is one of the things where like that will naturally get fixed as more stuff gets added to the game. They'll expand that. Like that's one of the things you can kind of hand wave away with like, oh, it's EA. Like so much of it is like it's not like the game is just lacking content. That's not the problem. Like most of it is like very intentional choices that are like neat, that look good, but when it comes to actually playing the game, it just feels so tedious.
I fully agree with Ben on this one as well. The current Atlas tree is quite unexciting and very pointless feeling. It feels like you don't actually have any decisions to make, and its effects feel like they're just part of the default mapping experience as a result. And what little there is super top heavy as well. We definitely had this issue in Path of Exile 1 earlier on, where mapping strategies came online so late that the average player had already quit. And in recent leagues for Path of Exile 1, it's been incredible. We have varied strategies for any player at every level of play. You've got progression trees, you've got low-level map farming strategies of different varieties, you've got mid-tier farming, and many, many late-game options. And it all comes online so quickly that you immediately start making interesting decisions as you progress through Path of Exile 1's endgame right now. And as much as I talked earlier about letting them cook and reopen old wounds to see what new things can be learned, I make exception for this one topic because I don't really see what they're trying to do with this current Path of Exile 2 tree. My only next explanation is that it's literally just like a tiny placeholder until they can do more. I hope that's the case, because it feels like you don't start unlocking anything interesting until you start getting to tier 15 maps, or like after you've done a bunch of tier 15 maps even. And at that point, it's just way too late for most players.
It doesn't know what it wants to be. That's where I feel like the gem system currently is. I feel like the gem system doesn't know what it wants to be. Because originally, gems were going to be not damage multipliers. Like supports were not going to be damage multipliers, but then they made them damage multipliers, and then they added a 1 support gem limit, which just feels really weird. Like I don't like it at all where it currently is. I feel like either of the other options are better than what it currently is. It's in this like weird like halfway point where like making it so there's no damage multipliers on supports and it's all utility could be a thing that could feel good if it was done right. And just keeping the PoE1 system of like your supports just make you do more damage also obviously feels good. We've been using it for 12 years, it's been good. But this current in-between thing just creates these really annoying scenarios where I want to use multiple active skills and I can't because there aren't support gems for it. Like I'm sitting there on a 5 link and getting a 6 link wouldn't matter because there's not a support gem that works, that actually helps me. And it's like, that feels really weird. And maybe as they add more active gems to the game, that'll be better if they also add more supports, but like, I don't know if they will.
So initially I thought these thoughts on support gems and the skill system seem to be pretty much pure opinions. I was like, I can't really engage with it too much. But then that last point is kind of interesting. There's about there just not being enough support gems, right? So there's definitely not quite enough to support the design they've chosen for the support skill system. Just like there's not enough active skills, right? And it leaves a lot of gaps. In case you're unaware though, we currently have 6 of 12 classes and only 12 of 36 ascendancy. That's only 1/3 of the planned ascendancies. Each of the primary classes is coming with another weapon type and all of the active skills that come with that, including flexible active skills like spirit skills, curses, and everything that can be weapon swapped into. I'd estimate that we probably have about a quarter of the active skills that are likely going to be there for launch, and probably about half of the support gems. It's pretty crazy the amount of skills and supports that they're planned and have to make here because of the amount of classes that they've chosen to do and weapon types and things. It's going to be a lot of work for them. I don't envy them that. But I think the current design of only 1 of each support per character is brilliant. It does need enough options that you do have to make decisions for each skill though. It's an interesting thing to balance actually, because you need enough options to be able to make decisions, but not so many options that your decisions start to become meaningless again. Allow me to elaborate here. It's probably a big enough topic to spend a whole video on, but to put it as simply as I can, if you're allowed to use scattershot on every skill, you will, right? If you have enough of the best damage supports to use on every skill that you can, you'll use them. And that means that there's no room left over for skills that do different things. Skills that are built by the player for utility or for specific situations. Because you just go for max damage, right? Why wouldn't you? Without the support limitation, you'd only ever use skills the way the developer intended as well. You'd only ever use a clearly utility skill that's been designed for utility for utility. You wouldn't like think creatively about different skills that you could make into utility in different ways like you can now. As it is now, there's room to actually decide for yourself how to use each skill. I think ZiggyD is on the right path with this one. With a bit of refinement and some more options, I think it'll start paying off even more.
We'll see if they will. Oh shit, the mana cost. Wait, I'm not even gonna bother. I'm not gonna bother. The funniest thing was when Karm was bitching in guild chat, he got like an insane weapon. Super good weapon, like 700 top end plus 7, and his Hammer of the Gods costs more mana than his character had.
So the topic of mana is a hard one. I'm really unsure on it. Initially, I was pretty negative on it. I was a bit concerned about that, plus the attribute system. The tax for those seemed really high. But now I'm maybe neutral to positive on mana at least. I'm still unsure on attributes as well. Historically, I've felt that mana was a waste of energy to try and make relevant in action RPGs because running out of mana just feels bad and it's not an engaging system to try and solve. So I was just like secretly happy when it was like one passive and you solved it. But maybe they're getting somewhere with PoE 2's mana balancing. Mana costs feel solvable in a variety of ways right now. Leech, although that's quite narrow. Raw mana, regen, mana on kill jewels, or passives even. You can anoint a 2% mana on kill passive if you don't know about it. Reducing costs of the things, converting some of them to life, using blood magic, things like that. All of them feel relevant and useful, and a combined approach of several of these things has been effective for me. It's remained a consideration as well, like how do I deal with mana and how many plus skills am I getting, and you know how much is it going to cost me to solve that problem? And that's remained relevant from start to finish, from Act 1 through into late endgame. I didn't like just get one leech node early on and then never think about it again like I did in Path of Exile 1 originally. So I think it's a valid build and gearing challenge that they've managed to balance surprisingly well here for this early in the game. And it's present from Act 1 to late endgame. As Ben mentioned, plus gem levels can get really insane, but maybe that's good. It's a powerful scaling option that has a real drawback, posing a cost and build challenge if you want to take full advantage of it, right? I do admit that I don't have enough build experience variety with the variety of different builds here to really judge how it feels across the board. So I'm probably missing, you know, some builds where it feels really awful in general. And I don't really even know if that it's working well enough that the upsides are worth the potential stress it adds to new players. Like, it's working kind of fine for me right now. I'm managing mana well by knowing all of my options and how to tackle it, but I suspect it kind of punishes newer players disproportionately, you know, overly punishing them because of their knowledge. They get a nice plus gems weapon and they don't really know all of their options for solving the mana problems that presents, and that might not be worth it. So, I don't know. I probably need some more time to sit with this one, play some more builds, and see how it plays out, and hear some more opinions from new players as well.
Maybe in 5 years. I just want quarterly updates for this game, and maybe port back the gem system, but without the one support gem on it. Because that's genuinely the thing that I've been most excited for since fucking 2020 when they announced that shit. Like, that gem system has so much more potential than this one does. I don't like its current, like, the way it currently works, but like, it could be so good, especially in the campaign. Like, God, dude, gems in the campaign are so fucking bad in Path of Exile 1. Like, you just wear, like, your Act 1 3 link for 4 acts, then you wear your Act 3 4 link for 10 acts, because, like, you don't have currency manipulating tools for your sockets until you're in maps, and it's, like, it's so dog shit in the campaign. Like, that gem system plus new ascendancies, what a beautiful world it could have been. I don't like the investment you have to do on a single gem in PoE 2. So one thing that feels kind of weird about that right now, it feels like the drop rate and the whole way the gem system works would make more sense if you instead 6-linked your character slot, not the gem itself. But the problem with that is you can't trade that. So like, as soon as you consume that thing, you can't trade it, which I'm pretty sure is why it doesn't work that way. Be consumable. Yeah, but like, things being tradable is very important to them. It always has been. Like, you make a good item, you can then trade it later. You 6-link that item, you can still trade it later. So like, the gem itself being the thing that gets 6-linked makes sense, because then you can trade it later if you want to. But the downside of that is like, the ability to test different skills is kind of limited as soon as you're in the end game, because if you 5-link a skill and you kind of like are like, wait, now I want to test this other one that's thematically similar but not quite the same. In this game you can just swap your gems and your thing, but in that game you can't, because like the gem itself is a 5-link. I don't really know if that's a bad thing though, but I also generally play the game with pretty, like, I plan out everything I'm gonna do very far in advance, so like I don't really run into the negatives of that. I feel like in the campaign you can easily like test 3-links and 4-links constantly and test new skills, and by the time you get a 5-link you should like kind of know what you want, I guess. I don't know. But if you find like a shit skill, can it actually sell? I haven't looked at trade markets and whatnot.
Ben outlines here how problematic the gem system is in Path of Exile 1. It locked you into gear, and it's awkward and difficult for new players especially. This new system is a bit of a gem lock-in issue, like Ben mentions, where it's a bit hard to experiment at certain points, but I do feel like it's an improvement overall to the gear lock-in that Path of Exile 1 had. I was very relieved to be able to just change my gear kind of whenever I want, right? And only engage in the gearing puzzle and not have to be like stuck on a random chest because it's the only way that I can get a 4-link while I'm leveling. It is a little hard to swap gems around for testing at early endgame, but it ceases to be a major problem by mid to late endgame, I found. As long as you don't consider like 5-socket gems to be mandatory for testing and figuring out your build, which I don't consider that to be mandatory. It could probably just be solved by making jewelers a bit more common, or by giving some alternative ways to get 4-socket gems, for example, some league mechanic that drops that sort of stuff.
Can essences please drop 100 rarity mapping views, 1 per jeweler per 2 days? I did 100 rarity mapping for like 10 days playtime and didn't drop a single one. I actually had the 154 rarity for 10 days playtime farming breach with rares. I got 1 perfect 6-link on like day 2 on a no rarity character, and I got my last one like a day before I stopped playing. But I think that was just unlucky. Like most people that I saw had better RNG there. Like Alk rolled hardcore self and had 2 in like a day, and he's just better.
I've had 2 greater essences as drops so far in hundreds of hours, and that's with running the essence nodes as well. In my opinion, ZiggyD could solve most of the crafting system problems as they're present right now and improve things dramatically, even a lot of the stuff that Ben specifically talks about in this video, if they just made greater essences and most of the omens really common. And I mean actually common, like you can start getting them at the end of the campaign and early endgame. It's just wild how rare they are. They're such like an obvious right there solution to so many things. But no regular player is ever going to find or use them. And that means that they're stuck with only ever exalt spamming. And exalt spamming's fine and fun. I enjoy it. But there needs to be that partial control over about like 2 to 4 affixes on an item. And that's just not there right now.
Oh, also one other good thing to talk about, instead of only talking about the bad things, the breach boss is fucking sick. That boss is really good. And Arbiter Phase 2 is pretty sick too.
So Ben inspires me here to talk about what we love about Path of Exile 2. Oh my god, is it so easy to get bogged down and lost in the feedback cycle and doom and gloom yourself into forgetting about how much fun you're actually having. Do try to resist that spiral by, disengaging from time to time, and enjoy yourself if you are indeed enjoying yourself. That feedback is obviously super important, and for me, despite having a lot of specific and highly critical feedback about specific parts of the game, I am overall really enjoying myself and feeling quite optimistic and positive about the future of Path of Exile 2. I'm super engaged in the game still 2 months in, which is pretty good, and I've been reveling in learning its many nuances and making content for the game. And I'm also psyched at how many new players have joined us and how excited they are and hearing about their experiences, and I've been really jazzed to make beginner's guides for them. So here's just a rapid fire list of what I love about this game so far, if you'll allow me to gush for a moment. The art, environments, and effects are incredible. The music and the sound effects are amazing. The core gameplay of moving characters around and just fighting monsters is so good, especially in the campaign. I always say if that you can make the basic act of pushing a button feel good in a video game, then you're most of the way towards having a good video game. The enemy design is sick. So many new and interesting enemies that actually do things. And yeah, even some white monsters make you take notice of them like ZiggyD said that they wanted. How cool is that? The bosses. Oh man, the bosses, right? Act 1 Count is my favorite action RPG boss of all time. So good. The music, the sounds, so many different abilities, such a good rhythm and pacing, the slam poetry timed to the attacks in wolf form, incredible! And so many of the even basic bosses in the campaign are more interesting than even endgame bosses of Path of Exile 1, let alone any other action RPG. It's such a step up. The boss team in particular is really popping off. What else? I love exalt slamming things. I love grenades and crossbows, how cool are those? I love the skills. So many of them have multiple things going on. And you can take a bit of time to kind of digest that and think about that and all the ways that you can use them together and what supports to use. Each time I start leveling a new character, there's like this whole period of discovery that's just so exciting. I love the map bosses, just give me more of them. I love the trial of SEKHEMAS, crazy, I know. It's not everyone's favorite way to ascend, I totally get that. I don't know if it's the right choice for an ascendancy system, but as content to farm, it's so well executed. All the monsters have really well signaled attacks, and it's got a fun system where your strategy trumps RNG 99% of the time, unlike Trial of Chaos. I didn't even really like Sanctum in Path of Exile 1 that much, which is what this was inspired by, but I love SEKHEMAS here. It's a perfect fit for Path of Exile 2. And finally, I love that I'll be playing better versions of this game for years to come. If I'm enjoying this scuffed version of Path of Exile 2 as much as I am right now, then I cannot wait to see how much I will enjoy it when it's actually good, right? There's a bit more to Ben's video, but that covers the most important parts and what I wanted to comment on. Definitely check his video out for a bit more context and info on his perspective. And I appreciate that his video helped me reflect on my own review of the game and kind of finally get it out there in a spoken form. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about it too. Look forward to reading your comments. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.